How years ago was the Constitution written? If you have a guess, drop that in the chat really quick. How many years ago was the Constitution written? I'll give you a hint. It's more than 200 years. It's less than 250 years. 236 years ago, our Constitution was written. So the US Constitution is the supreme law of our land. And it's a pretty good sized document. So for this presentation, we're just going to focus on the first three articles of the Constitution, which talks about the three branches of government. All right, so we're going to go way, way back in history to before the Revolutionary War. There were a wealthy group of men who united the 13 colonies to fight for independence from Great Britain. After the Revolutionary War, these men created documents to provide the people of our new nation with law and order. And these articles were called the Articles of Confederation. But these didn't work out very well. They failed because the central government really had no power to enforce any of those laws. So they went back to the drawing board. A constitutional convention was held in Philadelphia where 39 delegates worked to write the Constitution. Now, as you can imagine, there was a lot of discussion and debate and arguing. It wasn't easy to write the Constitution. When we think of a meeting or a convention, we usually think of it lasting a few days. Any guesses on how long the Constitutional Convention lasted? Put that in your chat really quick. Take a guess. How long do you think the Constitutional Convention lasted? Well, it took 4 months, almost 4 months, for them to write the final version of the Constitution. The Constitution was signed on September 17th, 1787, and ratified in 1788. Ratified just means that all of the states had to agree that they approved it. So September 17th has been the official Constitution Day ever since. So the men who were responsible for construction of the Constitution are referred to as our founding fathers. Some of these may look familiar to you, right? We've probably all heard of George Washington, our very first president. All of these men were presidents of our country except one. Which one was not president? That would be Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton served as Secretary of the Treasury under President George Washington. All right. The Constitution, of course, is the framework for our country's government and forms the relationship between our federal government and with the states and its citizens. So first, let's take a look at the preamble to the Constitution. If you have your Constitution handout, if you have your own Constitution, find the preamble. That's that paragraph before the first article. All right. Here's the preamble. So the preamble of the Constitution describes the purpose of the document and government. And there were 5 reasons the creators of the Constitution wanted to establish this document. I want you to get a pencil or a highlighter ready because we are going to underline those 5 reasons. So get your pencil or highlighter ready. And let's just read through this and find those 5 reasons. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice. There's number one. Underline establish justice. Ensure domestic tranquility. There's number two. Underline ensure domestic tranquility. And that just means preserving the peace among communities and people in the United States. Provide the common defense. There's number three. Underline provide for the common defense. Promote the general welfare. Go ahead and underline that. And promote the general welfare is referring to creating laws that promotes the overall well-being of all the people of the United States. And the last one, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. So let's underline that. Secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. What in the world does posterity mean? That's a really big word. Well, posterity is referring to you. Posterity means future generations. So our founding fathers wrote the Constitution with you in mind. They wanted a Constitution that would last generation after generation. All right, so let's start looking at the first three articles now. These articles explain how the Constitution used safeguards when handing out powers throughout the different branches of government so that no branch could have too much power. All right, so again, have that pencil or highlighter ready because we're going to be marking some important information. Let's take a look at article number one. Find article number one. It looks like an I. That's a Roman numeral 1. And go ahead and circle that. Article 1, once you've found that. Article 1 talks about the legislative branch, and they are responsible for making the laws. All right, so let's look at section 1 right now underneath the heading. Kind of read through that. The legislative powers are given to who? What does that say in that very first sentence? All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested, that means given, in a Congress of the United States. Go ahead and highlight or underline Congress. All right, let's keep going. Section 1 gives all legislative powers to the Congress, which consists of two parts. And what are the names of those two parts? Congress has two sides to it. It says, shall consist of the Senate and the House of Representatives. So let's underline Senate and House of Representatives. Good job. Okay, so remember, Article 1 addresses the legislative branch. It's referred to as Congress, and they are responsible for making the laws. We'll be talking some more about the legislative branch a little later. All right, let's find Article 2 now. Look in your Constitution. Find Article 2. It looks like an 11, but that's Roman numeral 2. Once you've found it, go ahead and circle Article 2. Article 2 talks about the executive branch, and the executive branch enforces the laws. So let's find out what exactly does the executive branch refer to. So let's read under section 1. The executive power shall be vested in a what? President of the United States of America. Go ahead and Highlight or underline that. So the president has the power in the executive branch. And how long will the president's term last? Put that in your chat real quick. We read on, it said he shall hold his office during the term of how many years? Throw that in the chat real fast. All right, 4 years, good. Let's highlight that fact. All right, and then the final part of this paragraph, who will be elected with the president? Put that in the chat as well. Who else is elected with the president? Yes, that is the vice president. So let's underline vice president. Okay, so interesting side note about the president and the vice president. Originally, in section 1 in article 2, the writers of the Constitution decided that people who wanted to run for president would run for president. The person with the most votes would be president. The person with the second most votes would be vice president. All right, so then they discovered, that probably didn't work out very well. That wasn't a really great idea. And can you think of maybe why? If you think about our elections, sometimes a lot of insults are thrown back and forth. It's not very congenial. And so sometimes we ended up with a president and a vice president who didn't want to work together. Fortunately, in 1804, they passed the 12th Amendment. And now we have presidential elections where the person running for president chooses a running mate, the person that they would like to serve as vice president along with them. And so they run together as partners on the same ticket. The great thing about our Constitution is that we are able to tweak it and change it by adding amendments. All right, so to review, Article 2 talks about the executive branch, and that power is given to the president, who enforces the laws in various ways. All right, on to Article 3. Find that in your Constitution and circle Article 3 or highlight Article 3. Article 3 talks about the judicial branch, and the judicial branch interprets the laws. So if we read through that first sentence, it states the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one what? Shall be vested in one Supreme Court. So let's underline that, Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court's main focus is interpreting the laws and deciding if they follow the Constitution or don't follow the Constitution. Very difficult job to try to interpret that. All right, so again, Article 3 is the judicial branch. It is the power is given to the Supreme Court, and All right, let's go on. Okay. So why do we have these three branches of government? The founding fathers really had a pretty good reason for doing that. Dividing the government into three branches is called separation of powers. The founding fathers wanted to make sure that our government didn't allow for one person or one branch of the government to have too much power, like the king. Okay, this was one of the safeguards that was built into the Constitution. Why do you think it was so important to the founding fathers to make sure one person or group of people didn't have all the power? Think about, if we go back, we talked about the Revolutionary War. Why did we have the Revolutionary War? And so then how did that influence their decision to have the separation of powers? If you have an idea, go ahead and put it in the chat. Okay, so right, they didn't want to repeat what they just gone through. They just separated from a king who they felt was unfair. They were taxed unfairly. And so this way they knew that that wouldn't happen again. There wouldn't be one part of government who could rule unfairly. All right, the second safeguard to help run our federal government was the implementation of checks and balances. Have you ever heard of that? Checks and balances. How do they work? Well, let's take a look. This chart shows the flow of checks and balances. As you can see, there's lots of back and forth arrows there. If one branch wants to execute their rights, another branch is going to check them and make sure that they're not exerting too much power. So the executive branch has power over the legislative branch, and so does the legislative branch over the executive branch. Same thing with the executive branch and the judicial branch, or the legislative branch and the judicial branch. And we will kind of look at that a little more closely in just a little bit. All right, so I've given you an overview of the three branches. I think this is a really good time for a brain break. So what I'd like for you to do right now is kind of stand up where you're at, stretch your legs, hold your hands up, kind of wiggle. All right, march real slow, jog real fast, march real slow, jog real fast. All right, let's do something patriotic. Let's do a firework cheer. Okay, so here's how it goes. Boom. Psh. Let's try another one. Boom. Psh. One more. Boom. Psh. Good job. Wiggle your fingers. Roll your head around. Get all those kinks worked out. All right, thanks. Have a seat. All right, so now we're going to look at each one of the three branches of government. Let's start with the legislative branch. And do you remember which article addresses the legislative branch? The first one, right? Okay. So the legislative branch makes the what? They make the laws. Okay. Now, do you remember what the two bodies of the legislative branch are called? One is the Senate, and the other is the House of Representatives, right? And both of them together are referred to as what? They're referred to as Congress. So when we talk about the legislative branch, Congress is kind of interchangeable with that. All right. So what you're looking at here, this beautiful building is our nation's capital, and this is home to Congress. So the Senate chambers are on the left side of the Capitol building, and the House of Representatives chambers are located on the right side. All right, test of your knowledge. How many senators do we have? How many senators serve in our nation's capital? Put that in the chat really quick. How many senators do we have? That's right. We have 100 senators. Each state elects 2 senators so that all states are represented equally regardless of their size. Now, you remember I said earlier there was a lot of discussion and debate while they were writing the Constitution. And one of those debates came from the smaller states. They wanted to make sure that they had an equal voice in the government. Just because they were smaller, they still wanted to have be represented equally. And so this was one of those compromises. In the Senate, all states are represented equally. So we have in the Senate 100 representatives. How about the House of Representatives, or 100 that serve in the Senate? What about the House of Representatives? How many do we have in the House of Representatives? Put your answer in the chat. There are 435 in the House of Representatives. Why are there so many more representatives than senators? Well, that's because the number of representatives is based on a state's population. For example, Kansas has 4 members in the House, while California has 54. California's population is much, much bigger than Kansas. So if you're not in Kansas or in California, I challenge you to find out how many representatives you have from your state in the House of Representatives. All right. So what else does the legislative branch do? Not only does the legislative branch get to make the laws, they also have the power to collect taxes. Taxes are really important, right? Taxes pay for our roads, they pay for our schools, they pay for police protection, they pay for firemen. They provide so many important things. The legislative branch can also regulate commerce or trade. They can raise an army, and they can also declare war. This happened at the time of World War II, when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. Our Congress voted to declare war on Japan, and that's when we entered World War II. All right, so checks and balances. Remember, what actions can be done to limit the legislative branch? It seems like they have a lot of power, but this is where checks and balances come in. So looking at our chart, the executive branch, the president, can veto legislation or veto their laws, which basically says, I'm sending it back, try again. I don't like this bill. All right. The judicial branch can declare laws unconstitutional, which means the law you made doesn't fit the Constitution, so it can't be a law. Those are two of the checks and balances on the legislative branch. Okay, let's move on to the judicial branch. And do you remember what article of the Constitution addresses the judicial branch? Put that in your chat really quick. Which article talks about the judicial branch? Okay, that's Article 3. Nice job. Yes, we skipped over Article 2, but don't worry, we're going to come back to it. Let's talk about the judicial branch. This picture is of the Supreme Court building, the home of the judicial branch. Now, the judicial branch needs to make sure the laws are followed correctly. Remember, they interpret the Constitution. And also in Section 1 of Article 3, it talks about inferior courts. Sometimes we call these lower courts that are established by Congress. So let's kind of take a look at those real quick. So at the very top of our chart is the United States Supreme Court. So their decision stands and can't be changed. But we also have quite a few lower courts. Each state has a Supreme Court that goes directly to the Supreme Court. There are district courts, specialized courts, federal agencies, and those decisions can be appealed to the Court of Appeals. And from the Court of Appeals, if someone feels like that decision isn't satisfactory, then they can take it to the Supreme Court. But what the Supreme Court decides is what the final decision is. Now, like I said, the Constitution was written how many years ago? 236 years ago. They talked a little differently back then. And the way they lived was so much different than we do now. There are situations, circumstances, technology happening now that they could never have dreamed about, right? Never could they have guessed what laws we might need for some of those things. Can you think of some of those things? What do we have now that we might use every day that 236 years ago, they would have just had no clue? Think of what some of those are and put those in the chat. What's some things that you use every day? Some of us might say we can't even live without it. So how about the internet, right? Could they have ever foreseen the internet 236 years ago? They would have thought it was crazy, right? Social media, part of the internet, TVs, so many things we have now. And so you see how difficult that makes the job of the Supreme Court. How do you try to guess? How did the founding fathers, how would they deal with this when they wrote this 236 years ago? That's the job of the Supreme Court. Okay. Does anyone know how many justices sit on the Supreme Court? Really quick. How many justices do we have on the Supreme Court? Put in your answer. Yes, there are nine Supreme Court justices, okay? They are appointed by the president. So the president gets to decide if there's an opening in the Supreme Court. who will best interpret the Constitution and can nominate someone to the Supreme Court. Now, another check and balance, that's kind of not the end of the process, because then the Congress, the legislative branch, has to confirm that. The Senate has to confirm that. So just because the president nominates someone doesn't mean that they will become a Supreme Court justice unless the Senate confirms them. So if you look on the back row, the 4 justices on the back row are the most recent members to join the Supreme Court. And the newest member to the Supreme Court is Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. She was confirmed in April 2022. All right, now we're ready to look at the executive branch. And what article addresses the executive branch? That would be Article 2, right? Okay, so the executive branch enforces the laws that Congress makes. The president, vice president, and their cabinet make up the executive branch. And who is our president? President Joe Biden. And who is our vice president? Kamala Harris, right? And that's a picture of the current cabinet. When I'm talking about cabinet, I'm not talking about a piece of furniture. The cabinet is a group of people selected by the president to help advise him. The members of the president's cabinet do not have any executive power, all right? They are only there to help advise him on certain matters. Usually members of the cabinet are heads of each department. And another check and balance, the Senate has to confirm them as head of each department. So when I say heads of department, I mean like Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Transportation, Secretary of Education. All of those departments usually serve on the cabinet. All right, then there's the White House, where the president and his family live and work. Have you ever been to the White House? How many of you have been to the White House? I have not, but that's on my bucket list. I want to get there someday. All right. So as president, he's a really busy guy, right? He does many, many, many things. So let's take a look at a few of the responsibilities of the president. Okay, so the president can propose laws. As an example, President Eisenhower proposed many laws, and one of those established the interstate highway system. So because of President Eisenhower's foresight and his desire to have an interstate system, he proposed that law, and we now have an interstate system. The president can also veto laws. We mentioned that earlier. If the president doesn't agree with a bill passed by the Congress or wants something changed, he can veto it. Remember, that means he's sending it back. Try again. The president has the authority to nominate Supreme Court justices, which we just talked about. The president can grant pardons to federal offenders. So a pardon means that the president can release someone who's been found guilty of a federal crime. And this is usually done when the president feels like they've served enough of their term and they're remorseful for what they did. Okay. The president also has the power to make executive actions. And these are actions the president sees as necessary in order to execute the law. The Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order given by President Abraham Lincoln. All right, let's look at the checks and balances for the executive branch. They apply as well. All right, so here would be an example of the checks and balances. We've talked a lot about vetoes. Okay, so the Congress can pass a bill, the president can veto it, send it back, try again. But Congress can say, no, we want to keep this bill just the way it is. And with a 2/3 vote, they can override the veto. And even though the president doesn't like it, it becomes a law. All right, so looking at our chart, who provides the checks and balances when the president appoints a Supreme Court nominee? Do you remember who has to confirm a Supreme Court nominee? Put that in your chat really quick. Who has to approve a Supreme Court nominee? So that would be the Senate, right? Just because the president wants someone in the Supreme Court doesn't mean they'll end up there. The Senate has to confirm them. All right. Who provides the checks and balances on an executive order? So let's say the president declares this is what's going to happen. He makes an executive order, but there's a check and a balance on that. Who can say, nope, we're not going to approve that executive order? Put that in your chat. So that would be the Supreme Court. They can say that executive order is not constitutional. And then it's null and void. It's not going to happen. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about President Dwight Eisenhower because he believes so strongly in upholding the Constitution. So let's look at some ways that he followed the Constitution. Okay. So it was the laws in the Constitution that he swore to enforce as President of the United States. So as the 34th president, he led the executive branch of the United States from 1953 until 1961. Let's take a look at a few of the ways President Eisenhower fulfilled his role in the executive branch. He appointed 5 members to the Supreme Court. Now, this is kind of a big deal. There's only one other president who appointed more members to the Supreme Court, and that was Franklin Roosevelt. He appointed 8 members to the Supreme Court. Ulysses Grant and William Taft also appointed 5, but other than that, no other president has appointed that many or more. He also helped negotiate the St. Lawrence Seaway and many other trade and economic policies. He pardoned over 1,000 people. He vetoed 181 bills. So he wasn't afraid to say, that bill needs to be changed. I don't think that bill is what's best for the American people. And this was a really important executive order that he made. He sent federal troops to maintain order and peace while the integration of Central High School and Little Rock, Arkansas took place. He felt that the students who were being integrated needed protection. And so he sent members of the 101st Airborne there to protect them. Okay. You know, President Eisenhower believed so strongly in the Constitution that he had this to say about it. No treaty or international agreement can contravene, that means break, the Constitution. What do you think that means? No treaty or international agreement can contravene or break the Constitution. What does that mean to you? Go ahead and put your answer in the chat. All right, so no one outside of the United States can break our Constitution, right? Um, the Constitution was written for the people of the United States, and the people of the United States are the ones that keep our government running and support our government. All right, so let's take a quick quiz now and test your knowledge about the three branches of government. Are you ready? How does the Constitution separate power in our government? So we talked about the separation of powers, right? What does that look like? How did our founding fathers use separation of power? What did they do? Go ahead and put your answer in the chat. Okay, they made the three branches. They divided the government into the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. Nice job. Next question. Dwight Eisenhower was the head of what branch of government? Was it legislative, executive, or judicial? Which branch of government was he the head of? Share your answer in the chat. He was the head of the executive branch. Very good. Okay, next question. How many justices serve on the Supreme Court? Quickly put that number in your chat. How many justices serve on the Supreme Court? Nine. That's right. Okay. How many senators does each state have? How many senators does each state have? Throw your answer in the chat. Two. Nice answer. Remember that every state has the same number, equal representation in the Senate for a total of 100 altogether. How does the president have checks and balances over the Supreme Court? So in other words, what kind of power does the president have over the Supreme Court? What can the president do? He appoints justices to the Supreme Court, ones that he think best interpret the Constitution. The number of representatives to the House is determined by each state's what? What determines the number of representatives to the House of Representatives? We have to know the state's what? Population. The number of representatives of each state is determined by each state's population. Nice answer. And Congress is made up of the Senate and I just talked about this one. What are the two houses of Congress? The Senate and the House of Representatives. Nice job. Okay. So I just want to thank you so much for joining us here today to learn more about the three branches of government. What branch do you think you would like to be a part of? You know, as citizens of our country, it's important that we are involved in our government, that we vote, and we take part in our government. So that's a pretty important question. If you could be a part of one of the branches of government, which one do you think you'd like to be a part of? Would you like to be president someday? Maybe a senator or a representative? Maybe a Supreme Court justice, right? Think about that. It'd be a good goal to have, right? Okay, I hope that you were able to continue learning about the Constitution. Maybe you'll join us for some more of our sessions today. Are there any questions that I can maybe answer for you? All right, thank you so much and have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.